This is North of Normal, a podcast about Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. My name is Andrew Hunter Scholey, and today we are talking about Comic Book Confidential. Released in 1988, directed by Ron Mann, credited to Ron Mann and Charles Lippincott. Today, we're breaking with formula a little bit. We have two guests here. Hey guys, how you doing?
Good.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, well, why don't you guys introduce yourselves, what you guys do, maybe your history. Well, I mean, we're doing a documentary about comic books, the first documentary on this show. Tell us about yourselves.
My name's Chris Bousquet. I'm a longtime comic fan, and recently I've been starting to do interviews and reviews of comics for Sequential Magazine.
I'm Andrew Clark. I am a local independent comic book artist. I've been doing comics since I think 2007, we'll say, starting with a web series, and currently working on my own creator-owned book called Adam, which I'm working on issue 6 right now.
The gestation of this episode is a little bit different than most. Usually whoever is the guest approaches me and says that they wanted to do the film. Well, I was looking about and I found out that Comic Book Confidential was Canadian. I'd seen it years ago, but it had never sunk in that it was. Actually won the Best Documentary Feature at the 1989 Genie Awards. This is a first gimme where I decided that I want to talk about a movie because it's my show, and when I found out I could talk about comics on my show and a really great documentary, I said, hey, it's my show. So I reached out to you guys. I know you guys for a few years now. So what is your guys' background with Comic Book Confidential? I mean, I guess maybe we should run through a really quick history of it. Directed by Ron Mann, who's an interesting guy. I don't know if you guys have seen any of his other movies. He always does weird sort of counterculture themes. The two I'm going to point out is that in 1992 he released a really great one called The Twist about the 50s dance craze. And in probably his most famous one outside of Comic Book Confidential was 1999. He did one called Grass. He's also done one about psychedelic mushrooms. He's kind of into that sort of stuff. And then I think a couple of years ago he released a documentary on the filmmaker Robert Altman. So in the mid-'80s, he was working on a press kit in LA for a movie called Legal Eagles. I think it was an Ivan Reitman movie. But basically, after hours, he started going to Comic-Cons and stuff and stole the equipment and used it at night and would go out and just started interviewing people at cons. And we're really lucky he did because there's a lot of great information here. Guys, what's your background with the movie?
Well, I'd seen it years and years ago, so I mean I can't even tell you how long ago it was, and I rewatched it again recently in preparation for this. But yeah, I don't have too much of a history with the movie itself, but just with the comics that are in it.
I had never heard of it before. I had watched many documentaries on comics, and maybe just because it wasn't new, maybe I just never heard of it.
Yeah, so. I mean, like I said, I had seen it years ago, and still, for my money, this is the best single movie, like documentary source, if you want just a catch-all history of comics. There hasn't been anything else put out after that's any better. There are great documentaries about comics, like I think about The Image Revolution is really good. A couple of episodes of the Robert Kirkman series a couple of years ago are really good. But they're really focused on very specific periods of comics. So there's a lot crammed in here. And I also think one of the things about you saying that it's being older, I think it's really interesting because, one, he was, and we'll get into some of the interviews in a bit, but he was able to get people like Will Eisner and Jack Kirby while they were still alive. Yeah. And it's really just before comics hit into a completely different realm, with shortly after this, The Dark Knight Returns, which they talk a little bit later, and Watchmen just kind of changes comics and how they're made, and kind of the indie craze wasn't over, but just kind of became really overshadowed. So we can anyone have anything to add before we...
Yeah, like you said, I think we're pretty lucky to have this documentary, just having it as a thing that exists, because there's so many cartoonists and creators that were never filmed over the years, and you know, it's not easy to find an interview with Jack Kirby, you know, like on film that he can actually watch.
Well, I mean, 30 years before this documentary, it was common for artists to not even be credited in the books.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, like famously, unfortunately the footage isn't in here, but he did interview Carl Barks. I have no idea why it didn't make it in. But, you know, for years he was just known as the good duck artist. and fans spent years and years trying to figure out who was the artist who did Scrooge McDuck for all these years, so it does play into the whole idea of like creator rights and stuff like that a little bit, and giving them a voice. I think that's going to come up a few times with some of the interview subjects that I might have some opinions about, but most prominently, before we go into it, like Ron Mann said that there was nobody that turned him down. Like, everybody in the comics field knew that this was an important film that was happening. Like, people would go out of their way to be interviewed for that legitimacy, and one of the biggest supporters was Will Eisner. And after the movie premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, he approached Ron Mann and told him we no longer have to apologize about comic books. Like, it was kind of viewed within the industry that this was a very legitimizing thing about the medium. Kind of, people always say comics aren't for kids anymore, but showing that there definitely is a world outside. And that's the other I think the biggest strength about it is that they kind of gloss over superheroes a lot. Like, they kind of do the basics, but I love the whole gag that they have, and meanwhile with superheroes, and then they have like the weird animation that we're going to get into, just kind of jumping back to it, but really showing kind of what you can do in the medium. And I think that's interesting. Like, I've discovered so many creators because of that documentary. I saw it, I think, when I was like 18, 19 years old. And it was so eye-opening, and seeing footage with people like Will Eisner that I had heard the name, but I definitely never seen a Will Eisner comic at all.
I agree. After I was done watching it, it felt good to feel like there was a thing out there that was sort of portraying comics in a different light, because when it did start out, it starts out talking about the superheroes in Marvel and DC, which is stuff we all kind of knew. I think anyone in here knew about that stuff. So once it delved into the more indie stuff, the underground stuff, that's when it really took off for me. That whole middle chunk is the heart of that movie to me. There's so much interesting, just the characters that you see. Like, anytime you watch a documentary on like rock music, they'll go into like the punk era and that kind of stuff. They don't just talk about Michael Jackson all the time, or whatever the glossy music is at the time. That shows my age, that I think Michael Jackson's the glossy music at the time.
Well, and that's my complaint about most comic book documentaries, is that they always hit the same beats. You know, there was like an A&E series, I think, like narrated by Liev Schreiber a few years ago. And for anyone who knew anything already about comics, it was so boring, because it was like, and then Watchmen came along and comics weren't for kids anymore.
Exactly.
You know, and talking about how Dark Knight Returns changed everything, and Frank Miller and Alan Moore, and just, it's exhausting because there is so much out there. And that's one of the things, especially as I get older as a comics fan. Like, when I was a teenager, I was a superhero kid. But we're recording in my place. Like, I definitely have a bunch of superhero comics here, but I have a whole crap ton of just anything I can get my hands on a lot of the time, sometimes too much.
There's no such thing as too much.
Move across the country twice. There is something as too much. One thing I want to start off is from the very beginning, the introduction of this documentary is amazing. They credit him in the credits, but it's, I think you say it, Paul Maverdes is his name, doing over top of the credits, doing the page, and all the panels introducing the artist are done in the style of that artist. And I sometimes, looking at the art, I wonder if he did actually draw all of them.
Yeah, he did. The styles are all very
accurate. Yeah, for representing each artist.
Exactly. And it's a good question. I like to think that, I mean, hopefully the guy is that talented that he actually was able to recreate those. Because he does it, you know, whoever did it did a great job of representing the styles of each individual artist.
Well, I'm not too familiar with his work outside of the introduction of that movie, but the comic that gets brought up later on that I'm not too familiar with, what is it, the Fuzzy Furry Freak Brothers?
Right.
He worked on that, and have you ever seen the logo of Bob Dobbs from the Church of the Subgenius?
Can't say that I have.
The dude with the pipe?
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, he designed that.
Okay.
That's kind of his biggest stamp that he's known for. And then, of course, ending with the ink spill at the end of it.
Has Andrew ever done that? Have you done that, Andrew?
Yeah.
Spill my ink?
Spill your ink?
Because I wanted you in, because I wanted somebody who created comics on to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I first thought of you.
I've never spilled my ink, but I sometimes I'll go between pens and markers, and sometimes I'll use the brush, pen, and quill and whatever. And if you don't use a newer, nicer one, sometimes the ink will come out as you're making a line and just make this big splotch on your thing, which then that's when things get shadowed. There wasn't a shadow there before, but there's a shadow there now.
Do you have anything to kind of throw in the whole topic of, well, as an artist? Like, I'm not an artist. I jokingly do stickman cartoons.
Yeah.
So I have a very, like, I can appreciate the art. Obviously, we'll obviously talk about that with some of these guys. I don't know, like, did you find it inspiring? Did you find it...
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot of different styles.
There's a lot of different styles.
Here, yeah.
And it's really nice to see those different styles, because typically when you go into a comic book shop, you're kind of like inundated with the Marvel stuff or the DC stuff, and it all kind of looks the same.
And there's kind of a back corner.
And there's a back corner.
They have all the other stuff.
That's right. So when I go to like cons and to sell my stuff, you get to walk around and see all the different types of art, and it's kind of in your face, but you don't see that normally, you know.
Yeah.
And so it was nice to see them showcasing that, and that's why I really feel like that middle part, the whole underground stuff.
Yeah.
Because I got to be honest, my comic book history personally, from when I was a kid, I didn't get into the underground stuff. It wasn't part of where I was around or what I could see.
When I approached you to be on the show, you said that you really didn't know much before the 90s.
No, I didn't know.
But again, I wanted that point of view with somebody fresher coming into it, because like I said, I saw this as a teenager, so these names have been rattling around in my head for a long time.
Exactly. And for me, it was really nice to see, and I appreciate art on a different... it doesn't always have to be crisp, it doesn't always have to be clean, you know what I'm saying? As long as and for some of it, as long as there's a really good story, like, I hate to say this, but like Jeff Lemire's a really good example for that. His art's not exactly commercial art per se, like but his storytelling's amazing, like Essex County and stuff like that. I don't know if I'm going to say that's necessarily... And the Canadian creator.
The fact that despite this being a Canadian film, there are no Canadian creators interviewed in the film.
There isn't.
Which I guess because he was still working in LA, and that
makes sense.
But like there is no Charles Burns, you know, and people that were around at the time, Seth, you know, like none of these guys are interviewed. And I've seen, again, individual documentaries. The NFB put out a really fascinating one on Seth about 2-3 years ago that I have on DVD. It came packaged with like one of his art collections. Okay. Which was really cool, but it would have been nice to get some representation.
Exactly, just a little bit, just
of Canadians.
Maybe they'll do a second part two.
If you did, I guess it would have been for the 25th anniversary, which was a while ago. But
there was a good example of that. I can't remember. It was near the end of the movie, and I can't remember what her name is or what her comic strip was called. But it was the one where the two girls have the little boy on trial.
Yes. I had that written down because I love her art.
Yes.
First off. Sherry Flanagan.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I just put in my notes Elrod Execution. and that's one of my favorite strips.
It is
because number one, the art's amazing. And one point I was going to bring out, I think they interviewed 3 female creators, all from the underground scene. And their stuff is more out there than any of the other guys that they interview. They're going to some really weird places.
You're right.
And then there was, her comic is called Trots and Bonnie. And then Linda Berry, when you're talking about the minimalist art, you know, when she has the whole strip about, you know, getting your first period and how magically everything changes and you no longer want to climb trees. Like, that art is, I would almost say, brutal. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so grotesque and, like, no form to it, but it's great. It conveys the story awesome.
Absolutely.
But that was something I did definitely want to bring up, especially when I was doing my final watch last night. I'm like, these ladies, in terms of bizarreness and strangeness and pushing the edge, are kind of putting all these dudes to shame. Like, the dudes are, you know, talking the talk, and it's almost like the ladies are walking the walk, if you know what I mean.
And there's 2 different sides to it. Like, because with Adam, there's a bit of an evolution in the art where I tried to be really clean about it, and I kind of decided over time that it needed to be a little dirtier looking, I guess, because the story itself did not convey a cleanness to it, right?
To describe, you've been doing Adam for how many years?
6, I guess.
And how many issues have you put out?
Just 6, but we'll get into that later.
No, but my point being is that you've had a lot of time to evolve as well as an artist. Like,
that's right, and
that's kind of the main thing you've been working on too. So any evolution is going to happen in the book, right?
Exactly, and there has been. I mean, I know Chris here has. I think you have all the issues, so he could probably see how every issue I
do want to grab them off
things.
You at some point. Yeah.
Oh, I have them right here. No, I don't. But I was going to say the and I've already forgotten her name again. Sorry. The one with the
Trots and Bonnie.
Yes, Trots and Bonnie.
Sherry Flanagan.
Like she says in the beginning.
I want to read more of her stuff. I got to track some down.
Well, she's sort of self-deprecating in the sense that she says, you know, people said this about my art, and I should do children's books and stuff like that.
You can see why, though.
You can see it, but then the subject matter of that comic strip is quite very dark, really.
Yes.
And
You think the whole concept of a small child saying, or what? Oh no, it's the dog saying that capital punishment is hell on your electricity bills.
Yeah. but there's such a nice change there.
For those who haven't seen
mood,
it, basically what it is that it's a trial. It's a young girl and her dog. That's Trotz and Bonnie. And I would love to read more of these. I got to track them down now that I think about it. I'm going to make a note of bringing it up to Cal at Strange or something like that. Be like, do you have anything? Because sadly I haven't read more of her stuff. And they're putting a neighbor boy on trial, Elrod.
Yeah.
Because they say that he murdered and raped the cat.
He raped and murdered the cat. And they decided he was guilty because they found his footprint in the cat litter, and the flea collar was in his toy box or something like that.
And then they proceed to deem him guilty and execute him by putting him in a wading pool and tossing a toaster in.
Yes, with glee about how long the cord is. Yeah.
No, like I said, it's funny that's like one of the very first ones that we went to, because it is one of my favorite moments of the documentary.
It is.
Because, we should address the format, and we'll be going into this. One of the best things that this does is that they have the artists or writers narrate their own stories. It's really cool. And it's a really cool effect to kind of, number one, showcase their art and their storytelling, but also to kind of to hear their voice as they're speaking. And there are a couple for me that really stand out. The Trotz and Bonnie one, the Sherry Flanagan one is one. We'll get to it. I love the Harvey Pekar one, but I just love Harv. He's, out of all the creators in there, he's probably my individual favorite creator. And the other one I really like, we'll get to it, is Charles Burns.
Yeah.
So it starts off with a lot of archival footage. A gentleman named Paul Coates from a show that was called Confidential File, I believe was the name of the show. Kind of running through I always refer to it as the 10-cent scare, because I read a book on the sort of comic trials and stuff like that in the 50s called that, but that's what I always refer to it as. But
this is all the stuff that leads up to the seduction of the innocent.
Yeah,
eventually.
Exactly. Which they definitely go into, but that's what they open with. After you have Paul Maverites doing his opening, which kind of talks to the subversiveness and the sort of otherness of comics. Ron Mann even talked about it. I do want to get into this with you guys, that he would comment that he would get like dirty looks or weird looks from people in an airport if he was reading The Dark Knight Returns, because it was so uncommon, to see a grown man reading comic books in public. And a lot of that, I guess, kind of does stem from the comic trials as well. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to believe that they were considered subversive. You know what I mean? You see some of the crime comics. I love the whole footage when they do the archival footage of like the kids in the park reading comics, and then they get so worked up reading these crime comics that one grabs a knife and just starts stabbing a tree. He's so pent up.
The other one grabs the rock and starts looking at his friend with the rock.
Yeah.
I wanted him to hit his friend, to be honest. I thought that was going to add to it.
But
it would have brought some realism to it.
That's right, exactly.
But it's just crazy to think of. You know what I mean? That at one point, and all these sort of mass burnings of like comics and stuff like that.
That's been all through, like even with music and stuff like that, right? People just don't understand it. I actually had a conversation with my wife today about her son and video games.
Yeah.
Because I grew up playing video games, not as much now, but I had to sort of defend the idea that just because you play a violent video game does not mean you're going to go out and kill somebody. I grew up on Rambo and Terminator and
they had that with G.I. Joe toys when I was a kid, and I'm the closest thing to a pacifist on the face of the planet. The only fight I've ever been in was a play fight that went bad in the schoolyard.
To this day, as far as I'm aware, I have never killed a single person, and I've watched some very violent stuff.
Well, even like Dungeons and Dragons stuff too. It's the same.
It always seems like everything comes around eventually. Like it's like after Columbine, the first thing that they did is that they went after Marilyn Manson.
Exactly.
It's all, especially in the States. We're getting a little off topic. Any excuse to avoid like any sort of gun laws.
Yeah.
They'll blame anything on the face of the planet, and you see that just scattered throughout history that there's always something being scapegoated. And in the 50s, it was comics.
Yeah.
Weirdly, around the same time as the McCarthy trials, there just seems to be this whole thing of like, not trusting boomers and this new stuff that they were reading.
Exactly.
But like in terms of the interviews and what's great, you start off with Bill Gaines.
Yeah.
Who's I've been trying to track down. It's out of print, but he wrote a history of comics himself that is out of print, and I've never seen for less than $100 online. But I would love to get. But in terms of, there are a few people when I'm watching this, I'm like, I would have loved to have had a beer with this person, and Bill Gaines is one of them. Bill Gaines, who of course his father invented the comic book.
Yeah, the formatting and stuff. Yeah. That was something if I remembered it from the first time I watched it, I certainly didn't remember it anymore. So
well, yeah, the first comics were just daily strips, just basically repurposed and put into one thing.
Yeah.
The guy would have so many stories. Apparently Ron Mann, when he was a kid, was a huge fan of Mad, because Bill Gaines, amongst other things, started Mad magazine. Another thing in this documentary, like, you lose sight of how impactful Mad was when it first came out and how crazy it was.
Yeah,
but apparently Ron Mann originally phoned because he wanted to go to the Mad offices, and he got the janitor, and the janitor said, "Oh, Bill Gaines isn't here, come back some other time. Here, I'll give you this number." He said, I went into, Mr. Gaines's Rolodex. And then, like, a year later, when he finally got to go to the Mad offices and he got to meet Bill Gaines, he realized from the voice that the janitor was actually Bill Gaines, and he was just fucking with him. Like, he was just fucking with some kid on the phone, which I think is hilarious. And Bill Gaines comes up a lot in this, so we don't have to dwell for too long, because, like I said, he's going to come up again, especially when Mad comes up. Yeah, just a super interesting dude.
The amount of history he must, he would have had knowledge of is insurmountable, I think.
Now, this is one thing that I do appreciate about this documentary, I mean, they go into the history of it, but it doesn't really go into the minutia of it. It's not exhaustive. This is a documentary that's more about the creators and the artists than it is to be, this is a by-the-buttons, like, history of comics, and then this happened and this happened. It does go chronologically, but it doesn't spend too much time on anything.
It just scratches the surface. You could easily make an hour long movie about each one of these creators, and have tons of stuff left over to.
Bill Gaines alone. Yeah. I mean, you could do a 2-hour long movie and still not get to everything between him and his dad and Mad Magazine and the hearings that he got involved in and stuff like that. But then it starts with, what do you guys think of the montages? They kind of break up the movie with these sort of crude animated, I almost think like Monty Python-esque.
Oh, but yeah, that's exactly what came to mind.
Sketchy wooden montages. I think they're charming, personally.
I thought they were funny. They helped break up the movie, right? So it wasn't.
Well, it didn't encapsulate a long period of time. It's like, and then there were superheroes, and they just show like a whole bunch of superhero comics scrolling across, like most of which I've never even heard of. But it's a good way to convey like a sort of sense of time and passing in history. You know.
I agree.
Yeah, there's a ton of characters in there I've never heard of. I mean, they're from the early days of the comics that I guess we're doing like the 30s. There's just so many characters that go unheard of. Like you can't. I don't know. How do you hear about these guys? Without
by watching documentaries.
But it's like any other art, like it's movies, books, or whatever. Like there are going to be the people out there that will just read what's front and center. They'll read their Batman, they'll read their Superman, maybe their X-Men they'll get into. There are people that are going to listen to the Beatles and listen to the Rolling Stones, but then there are the guys that go further back and start listening to old blues music, psychedelic rock bands from the 60s, garage rock bands. Yep. And, there for any art, there's way more out there than the surface. It's just a certain personality type that just wants to push past that.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's fine. Enjoy what you enjoy, but there is a certain type that just wants to keep pushing further than just what's being spoon-fed to you, basically.
Yep.
And then we get into Will Eisner. You gotta love Will Eisner. I mean, I kind of view him as being the magical grandfather of comics. Like, he's definitely the, for lack of a better term, elder statesman. He did more to push legitimacy in comics than pretty much anybody else. Yeah. Specifically, I mean, most people don't know this, but the term graphic novel actually comes from him. When he released A Contract with God, which I have on the shelf here somewhere, he wrote it specifically to be released in bookstores, and he coined the term because he didn't want it being called a comic because there was nothing funny about it.
Right.
A story about a rabbi in the 50s having a crisis of faith. And that's where we got the term graphic novel.
Because in the movie, I think he uses the term graphic novel, right?
I think he does,
and
correct.
That was interesting to me because I didn't think, I wasn't sure when the term was first used, and I didn't know it was Will Eisner who said it for the first time. So seeing that, and I knew how old the footage was, it made me think, that's older than I thought it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was like, I assumed the late 80s in terms of coining that, but I don't know. Do you know when he coined that?
When did Marvel?
I'm trying to think, Contract with God, is it convenient over there? I know I have a copy somewhere. I can look at the copyright date in there and know for sure. I think it came out in the late 80s.
Okay, so then that is when that's when I first heard the term. So
Yeah.
I guess it's okay.
Well, because it wasn't until the late 80s when they started collecting Watchmen and like the Dark Knight Returns and stuff.
Cool.
And, like early Sandman books and stuff like that, then they actually started collecting like them regularly. And that's when they started referring to them as such.
Yeah.
Well, can never find too many books.
No.
Will Eisner, I mean, do you guys have anything more to say? I mean, like, what I was talking to you about before is when you look at the art in the spirit, and we have a few comics here that we're kind of flipping through as we're looking, and I do have a collection of Will Eisner Spirit comics. And one thing that I brought up to Chris beforehand is that when you watch the documentary and you see Will Eisner stuff, and then you look at what was going on in like, DC and other books, how leagues beyond Will Eisner's art is.
It really is.
Like how advanced and how modern. Like, it's weird. It looks better on the film.
Yeah.
Like, they do a really good job projecting the art and making it look really, really good.
In on it, yeah.
This is on more on like newsprint.
Yeah.
But like, it's amazing. Like, just the detail and the skill and the sophistication of the art, how advanced it is.
The sequential nature of it is jumps out.
It still stands out.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Comic Book Confidential with a friend maybe about 6 months ago, and he's into comics and had never seen it before, and he didn't know much about Will Eisner, and he couldn't believe, because this stuff came out, in the 50s?
Let's see. These stories, 48.
You see the 40s. Like, it's even older than I thought.
40, yeah, 1940, 41. These are all,
And
this contains a few different stories.
And my friend was watching the documentary being like, this came out in the 40s? Like, this stuff looks advanced for now.
Yeah.
And that's something I'd never really thought of, because I never really saw Will Eisner stuff in context of contemporaries at the time. But it's amazingly impressive what he pulls off. I mean, we were kind of joking beforehand that they're not the most entertaining comics to read, but they do look great.
We're also pretty lucky to be able to see, like, reprints today, they're higher quality.
Yeah.
But you can see that the line work a lot better than you probably could on some of the old.
Well, even the artist editions and stuff like that they put out. I mean, recoloring kind of drives me crazy.
Yeah, you definitely lose some of the original interpretation of what you got to see as a reader. But it's still nice to see that quality. It was lost, I think, in some of the old prints. You look at the old books.
Well, and certain artists would definitely draw a lot more crudely because the printing levels were so low.
Sure.
One thing I didn't know before, when I reassociated myself with the documentary, is that the Spirit was put out in newspapers, which I thought was really interesting to compete against comic books.
Yeah.
That they thought that they were losing business. So I guess that does make sense, because if you look at some of the old strips like Little Nemo in Slumberland, like the Winsor McKay stuff, Crazy Cat, I mean, that stuff is pretty sophisticated as well, but I guess they would have higher standards of printing than cheap comics.
Yeah.
And then one of the real gems that they have in here, I think it's safe to say that all of us to some degree are Jack Kirby guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely a big Jack Kirby guy.
Yes, I love Jack Kirby stuff. There's a lot of people, you either love him or hate him, but I mean, how can you not? Like, his sequential work is unrivaled, I think.
Yeah.
For back then anyway. And he did stuff that, I mean, he did stuff nobody else could do.
Well, they refer to him as bringing the third dimension into comics.
Yeah.
Instead of everything moving back and forth, left to right, like there's that. And just the amount of time that he did, like he worked on comics and he was still pushing well into the 70s.
And how prolific he was. I mean,
like even,
nobody can keep up with this.
He's known for the Fantastic Four, but like his romance comics, his war comics, like I spent years tracking down that collection that I have of the Losers. Mm-hmm. There's just so much, it's kind of hard to pin down. But talk about being lucky having that footage of Kirby. Apparently he that was the second time he interviewed him. The first time he interviewed him, Kirby was not very lucid.
That's what I heard. Yeah, he was getting older at that stage.
And sort of old age was sinking in. Yeah. Ron Mann left the interview and he went home and he destroyed the footage because he didn't want anybody seeing it. And then his wife, I believe his wife's name is Roz, anyways, called him a few days later and said, "Oh, Jack's a lot better today," and went and got the footage that we actually got.
Yeah. Nice.
So again,
see, that's something
to see someone like Kirby, like to give him a voice, because he's been a guy who's been, to talk about credit. We'll get to Mr. Stan Lee later.
Yeah.
Like somebody who just didn't get a lot of credit. Like, I'm a dude who watched Black Panther and I got weepy when I saw like Wakanda for the first time. I'm like, Jack would have loved this. You know what I mean? And seeing like the Kirby designs or Thor Ragnarok, like I love in these like Marvel movies when you can see the clear stamp of the creator on there.
I actually didn't know, because when my first collecting comics, I kind of stumbled into it a little bit, and it was G.I. Joe. I started buying originally.
I started with G.I. Joe as a kid, yeah.
and I didn't expand past that for a very long time. Every once in a while I might buy a Batman or a Spider-Man or something like that. So I actually was buying comics for a while before I even heard of Jack Kirby, because at that point he wasn't doing a lot for Marvel or anything at that point, I guess. But
even flipping through here, and I know this is a podcast, you can't see this, but I'm flipping through, I have a Jack Kirby collection of some of his Marvel stuff.
Go to page
and the photo
48.
referencing that he does, like the photo backgrounds and stuff like that. Like, the guy was playing with the medium and stuff like that, and he obviously loved it. But he also, you know, famously would tell kids that would come up to him for advice, you know, about how can I break into comics, and he would say, don't, you know, comics will break your heart. Because, you know, for as much as he contributed, he didn't get a lot back, and unfortunately the recognition didn't really come until, like, he was recognized with Marvel. Like, Stan Lee was really good at, you know, making sure that the creators, their names were out there in the comics and stuff like that. Like, Stan Lee did revolutionize how kids could read comics, you know, and kind of like the creators were an integral part of it. I wonder if Kirby's family gets any kickback from those billion-dollar Marvel movies.
Yeah, I don't know.
Probably not.
You would like to think that they do, but
it is cool that, you know, we get Jack reading Captain America #1.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really neat to be able to hear him read it.
There's a lot of ground to cover in this documentary. Pretty much right away they start going into the trials that we already talked about.
Yeah.
You know, Wortham, Seduction of the Innocent.
Have you ever read that?
No, I've never actually read Seduction of the Innocent.
Yeah, neither, no, I'd like to. I mean, trying to find a copy of it is not the easiest thing to do. It's expensive.
Yeah, I bet. And I can picture a lot of people aren't too keen to reprint it either.
No.
But for people who don't know, Seduction of the Innocent was basically this Dr. Wortham's book about how comic books are the main reason and cause of juvenile delinquency. You know?
Because it never existed before comics.
Never existed before comics. But also before World War II, suburbs didn't really exist. And growing up in the suburbs, boredom in the suburbs causes you to do dumb shit.
Yeah,
that was my experience.
It's true, yeah.
And then you see, you know, Gaines at the trial. He kind of decided he was going to go up, but he was doped up on some medication or something. That I would love to see all the footage from that trial and go through. There's a lot of footage in it, like archival footage, and I'm like, if there was more, just release it.
It's got to be available somewhere.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, they go into the creation of Mad.
Yeah.
Which is super interesting. Like, I really do want to get a collection of like those early Mad books. I've seen a couple of nice hardcover collections, but I've never shelled out the dough for them.
No, I've seen somebody has a collection of the early issues for over $5,000 right now, locally.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Because the one thing that this documentary does a really good job of is just showing how influential and huge Mad was.
Yeah.
You know, and how important it was as a book. And one of the funny things is that Kurtzman is telling about the formation of Mad and how he approached Bill Gaines after, you know, EC Comics folded and he had to stop making all of his crime because of the trials, all the crime and horror books that they were doing. And Mad spun out of that, which I find interesting. They made it the larger magazine size because then they didn't have to go with the comics code, which, again, for anyone who is listening to this and doesn't know much about comics, was basically the regulatory state that was kind of put in place to kind of make sure that comics...
Which, if I remember correctly, they didn't technically have to go through the comic code. They did it because it was deemed...
They agreed because, and they don't really go into this in the documentary, they figured that if they self-regulated, then the government would never stomp down on them ever again. So, but anyways, I was just going to say, it's so funny because there's Kurtzman talking about how he wants to do a humor book and how funny Mad is, but he's so dry. Like, he doesn't seem like he has a pulse, but I guess you get that with a lot of funny people, right? Like...
It translates to the page, though, so that's all that matters.
You know, they go into, obviously, then, after Mad, when the 60s, when the superheroes come back. Don't worry, guys, I won't go on one of my rants. Then we get Stan Lee, you know, who we talk about documentaries saying the same things over and over again about comics, and you have Stan Lee cranking out that old story that he's probably told millions of times of, well, I was going to leave comics, and then my wife told me. She said Stan. why don't you just write a book the way that you want to? And then he has the goal to say, and that is when I created relatable superheroes.
Didn't he just say he wasn't going to go into it? No, you're right.
I will stop.
He's the face. He's the face of comics that the general public understands. And I'm not going to lie, I got a soft spot for him in my heart, but I understand.
I mean, I'm a big
the
fan
hate
of Kirby and Ditko.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Hands down.
He's there. He's the mascot of what would have been modern comics.
And
at
I
the
always
time,
say I give
guess.
Stan Lee credit where credit's due. He was a good salesman. He was a good face of comics.
Yeah.
You know, he gave us the Marvel bullpen. You know, he gave us the dialogue and some of the ideas, but just, I think the amount of credit that he gets compared to some of the other people.
100%, yes. 100%.
Yeah, he was absolutely a needed face of comics at that time. And still today, even after his passing. That's sort of, he's still an ambassador after he's gone. But you're right, the credit definitely needed to be passed around more.
And the kids today, because of the movies and stuff, they just assume now that Stan Lee was the guy who created all these things.
Absolutely everything, yeah.
Everybody knows his face.
Mm-hmm.
But not everybody knows Kirby, or very few know what Ditko even looks like.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's all I'll say about Mr. Lee. Credit where credit is due, but I kind of find him exhausting at the same time. But then again, to this documentary's benefit, it is important. They talk to Stan Lee standing in front of his pinball machine.
Mm-hmm.
I do love that pinball machine.
Yeah, I want to actually bring it up. When I was watching it last night, we got the Propeller Arcade around the corner here, which is a pinball joint. And the guy who runs it, I'm going to bring up if he's ever seen that Spider-Man
Yeah, it's
one anywhere, because I would play the shit out of that machine. Okay, again, we got a lot of ground to cover here. Then we get into what you were talking about, Andrew, the sort of heart of the documentary, which is the 60s counterculture comics. Let's just run down names of people that we have. Well, obviously Robert Crumb.
Yeah.
I mean, the documentary Crumb that Terry Zwigoff did, I want to say late 90s, early 2000s?
I have not seen that.
You've not seen it?
No,
It is not only one of the best documentaries about a comic creator ever made, it is one of the best documentaries I've ever seen.
Okay.
It is really, really good. And if you have an interest in Crumb, definitely track it down, because
I could see a whole movie about him with him in it just being entertaining in itself.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, have you seen Crumb?
No, I have not.
Yeah, definitely track it down. It's really, really good. If I don't think I own a copy of it. I would totally loan it to you if I could. But, we go into people like Spain with his book Trash Man, which looks interesting. I'm not very familiar with Spain's stuff. Crumb with Victor Mosco. I really like the interviews with him in the warehouse.
Yes.
Where they're talking, just the two guys thinking back to the good old days.
How awesome would it be to go to San Francisco back in that time and just see everything that was going on?
Well, that's what's amazing. Like, we talked about footage of the comic trials, the party footage of all those guys hanging out.
Yeah.
It's just so interesting, and it's so funny. Like, you get this in the Crumb documentary too. Like, you see Robert Crumb, and he looks so buttoned up and formal with his funny little hat and his glasses and his mustache, but he was just such a huge acid head. And you see that, like, I don't think the dude actually has separate iris and pupils. Like, if you look at his eyes when he's being interviewed, they're just black. I think his eyes are just permanently dilated, and he's always on some sort of an acid trip.
It was amazing. It was great to see, and that's what I was saying earlier about how it was nice to see sort of the punk version of comic books come into it and everything like that. My favorite scene in this entire, from start to finish, and O'Neill, is he on there?
Oh, Dan O'Neill, yeah.
Dan O'Neill.
For the Air Pirates.
For the Air Pirates. That is my favorite scene in this entire thing. I actually had to rewind it and rewatch it.
Well, it's kind of inspiring.
It's inspiring, but he's playing pool in this
It's in a strip club.
It's in a strip club.
I always
and
thought
these
it was
two
staged,
women.
but apparently those two women were strippers that were on their break.
Okay.
And they were just playing pool, because I always thought it was staged.
It was an amazing scene that's really out of the blue, and they don't address it at all. There's just these girls in the back that position themselves to make sure they're on camera a little bit at any given time, and he's just talking about his Mickey Mouse thing, and that was an amazing scene. When I first watched it, I rewound it just to watch it again to see, am I actually watching what I think I'm watching? Because the one bends over to shoot the pool and everything, and she's wearing this outfit that
only existed in the 80s.
Only existed probably on that day
Is
in
that
the
sexy?
80s.
I don't know.
I don't know if it's sexy or not, but it's working for me. I think that's...
Well, I mean, the fascinating thing about that is, and now kind of explains the importance of this organization that's set up called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is, I'm more saying for people that might not be familiar with it, but has been set up to protect comic creators as a sort of legal fund if censorship basically comes down on him. And this is a perfect example. Like, there's almost a Lenny Bruce type quality of him railing against it. And he does make a really funny point that he's brought to trial because of this Mickey Mouse comic that he did, which I would love to read. Yeah. That's another one that I would like to track down and more of this guy's stuff. No, it's super interesting because he's saying, like, in the trial, that it's like, oh, it's a parody. They're like, no, that's really Mickey Mouse. So they're telling him that he made a real Mickey Mouse strip, and that comic book that he drew with, let's be blunt, Mickey bending Minnie Mouse over and eating her out is actually Mickey Mouse.
Yes.
So Disney is trying to argue that that is an actual Mickey Mouse comic, and the sort of circular, insane logic of that, and the frustration in his voice about the lunacy of it is just absolutely hilarious. And you're right, that is one of the high points of the entire documentary.
I think he said the trial took, what, like 13 years or something like that? Or how long did he say it went on for?
I have no idea.
It was a long time.
But it was a long time, yeah. That's my big takeaway. Him and who we were talking about before, Sherry Flanagan, are the two that I need to actually try to search out more of their stuff. I mean, they go into Gilbert Sultan and the Fuzzy Furry Freak Brothers or whatever. There's a certain type of 60s counterculture comic that I just kind of shrug and I just have no interest in, like the really drug tripped out stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we get out of this, though, does anybody have anything to say about Crumb?
I mean, his art style is just, I love it. It's not for everybody, but I love his line work, and his subject matter is all over the place. So,
Well, I mean, just absolutely grotesque. And it's interesting, though, because Crumb is one of those guys that I do like. Obviously, the book you're flipping through is mine. Like, I've read a lot of Crumb. But he talks about the need... the page from the actual thing, from the documentary, but him talking about the need to break taboos, that they grew up in such a rigid, structured life, that they had to get all of this...
That's one thing that...
So that's where... I'm just saying that's where I struggle. Yeah. That the sort of racist, sexist stuff that he has in his comics, but at the time, with the culture, just doing it to break taboos, and should we respect that in a creator? Or we're in a time now where we tend to chastise people for even attempting to go there, even if they're making a commentary.
I am a little conflicted with that, though, to be honest. It's like...
Because we have the book open here. We're looking at some pretty gross racist stuff on the page here.
And, it's hard to defend.
But, I mean, the comic is called All Asshole Comic. So he's kind of admitting on the page that he is being a shithead.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm torn, though. Like, it's still... I don't know if... Is it necessary? In some ways it is, in some ways it's not. But, I don't know. It's a time and a place. I mean, you would never see that today.
No, but the other thing, like, this wasn't widely distributed. This was for a very specific scene. Like, they were cranking them out in their apartments.
Yeah.
And selling them at, like, head shops around the corner, I've been able to flip through a copy of Zap Comics once.
Okay. I
knew somebody in Toronto that had one, and it was pretty damn near falling apart. Like, there were some pages ripped out that he jokingly said were ripped out to roll joints. But, Crumb is a super interesting dude, and as you said, a lot of these people you could do a whole documentary on, and they did. Terry's Wigoff documentary is incredible.
I will definitely be looking that movie.
Yeah, definitely do that. We talked about Trots and Bonnie. Yeah, that's pretty great. Then we get to what I consider the part of my least favorite part of the documentary, which is the Zippy the Pinhead sequence.
That guy is...
the Bill Griffiths.
That's weird. It's...
I have never read, nor do I have any interest in reading Zippy the Pinhead.
No, that whole thing, it really comes out of the blue.
But they kind of hold him up as being a big deal, and maybe he was at the time.
Maybe. There's a part at the end...
Because we're starting to get into the comics that are more contemporary to when the documentary was made.
Right. Yeah. And there's a part, you almost get a feeling he was very happy he was being interviewed, and he had this line, his last line, I think it is. He says, it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. And then he gets this, like, little smirk on his face, and that's kind of like the end of his... you're not the guy for that. I don't know. Like, it was a whole thing that fell
I'm sure
flat
he's a nice
for me.
guy, and maybe if I gave Zippy the Pinhead a chance, I would love it.
I guess, maybe. I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's one of those things, if you actually sat down and read one, maybe you'd get it. But
just him walking around dressed up as Zippy the Pinhead.
Yeah.
And then doing the whole thing. Like, they're just building it up to be a big thing, and I'm like, you cut out Carl Barks footage?
for this.
Like, interview the dude, show some of his work, and I don't know.
I'm with you.
Because then you got to also think about, like, well, where does this stop being a comic and become something else? You know, because there's that art presentation, the performance art almost side of it that's not really a comic anymore.
On his end, it's probably promotional stuff too.
Sure.
I mean, I'm guessing Zippy doesn't exist anymore. That's my guess, but
I remember seeing Zippy stuff when I was a kid.
Really, it was the first time I saw it.
Like, I remember. Well, we'll get into this. Like, I was lucky enough that they show footage from it. Silver Snail, downtown Toronto comic shop. You see the old location on Queen Street. Still to this day, one of the most gorgeous comic shops I've ever been in. But that's probably the first comic shop I ever went to. My father used to work down the road when I was a kid, and during PD days, my mom would ship me off with my dad, and I would go downtown, and he would literally give me like $5 or $10 and be like, "Here, go buy comics." And I would walk down Queen Street. I'm like 7, 8 years old, with like $10 in my hand, and I would just go buy G.I. Joe comics or whatever I could find there. So I saw a lot of these comics on the shelf, because Silver Snail was pretty top flight. Like, they had a lot of other stuff. You would go there and see huge collections of Mobius, like, it definitely wasn't just a place where you would just go, I think that's where I first saw, like, Love and Rockets and stuff like that. Like, I knew conceptually who these things were, and I don't know why they had to move, but they moved to Yonge Street, and it's not the same now. But that comic shop was just amazing, and my heart swells when I see that, because I started going to that shop when I was 8, and I did it all through my teens and 20s. Like, you would just be walking down Queen Street, and even if you didn't have anything to buy, you'd be like, "Oh, I'll stop into Silver Snail and just see what they got."
Yeah, I was lucky enough to get there once when I was a kid. I mean, I grew up in Montreal, so I had plenty of comic shops in Montreal, but I only ever made one trip to Silver Snail as a kid, and I remember watching the movie. I remember going into that spot, and it was definitely something that I hung on to.
Well, and on the production end, I don't have his name written down, but a gentleman that worked for Silver Snail was instrumental in getting Ron Mann hooked up to talk to a lot of these people. Ron Mann didn't know a lot about comics, so this guy who worked at the Silver Snail would tell him who he should interview for the documentary, which I think is really kind of cool.
Yeah, that's the best place to go. You go straight to the source.
And then we move on to Harvey Pekar. I am a Harvey Pekar guy. I love Harv. Out of everybody in here, I mean, obviously you have a love for, like, the legends like Kirby and stuff like that, but out of all the fringy guys, I have such a soft spot for Harvey Pekar. I have for years. Have you guys seen American Splendor, the movie?
I've seen the movie, yes.
I cracked that one open maybe 4 or 5 months ago, and I was like, this movie's delightful.
Yeah.
Like, I hadn't seen it since the theater, and I'm like, it holds up. And again, you can make an 1.5 hour long movie about Harvey Pekar. Like, that is absolutely ridiculous, and be a good movie. Yeah. Like, it's entertaining and interesting. I mean, for those who haven't read it, what separates Harvey Pekar from everyone else here is that he was not an artist. He knew Crumb back in the day. They're both from Cleveland. Apparently, according to the movie and the stories that I've heard, it was Crumb who was like, "You're really funny with these stories that you tell about mundane everyday life. You should really do comics about him." And he was like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, I can't draw." So Crumb did a lot of his early ones, but then he would just outreach. We addressed that one of the things that reassociated me with this movie is the podcast Comics Kayfabe did a film commentary of Comic Book Confidential, which is really interesting. Not all, but a good chunk of the information that I have for my research, because there's not a lot out there, came from that commentary and their knowledge. And Ed Piskor, who is currently a very favorite creator of mine. I mean, you can see I got the Hip Hop Family trees and stuff over there.
Design.
And got WYSIWYG on the shelf there. Like, I have a lot of his stuff. And I guess, did you go to Decaf this year?
I didn't have a table there this year, but I did.
You did go,
it,
yeah.
And
Him and Jim Rugg were there, and I was super excited because I also have, like, the Street Angel stuff. That's all Jim Rugg. But to meet them, because they're both, I got so excited when I found out that they were coming. Yeah. And Ed Piskor got his start in comics with Harvey Pekar. Because, when he was starting out after American Splendor, apparently Harvey Pekar was just, like, outsourcing as much as he could for artists that were willing to work and gave him a start. And in the commentary, it is so touching how emotional. Like, he literally says in the thing, like, Harv gave me my life. Literally gave me my life, which is really cool. And you read through like we talked about the whole thing about the creators reading over their own comics. That is one of my favorite ones. Is Harv reading the thing about him stealing the jazz records and then fucking up stealing the jazz records. And he'll have it. I don't know how much American Splendor you've read.
I've only got a few of the single issues.
But like, he'll do like a 3-page comic about how annoying it is to stand behind old ladies in the grocery store. Like, it's so not punk rock. It comes back around the other end and becomes punk rock.
Yeah.
In its mundanity. Like, it's so cool. And again, they did make an 1.5 hour long movie about fucking Harvey Picar. Like, that's crazy to me.
Yeah.
And it's a good one too.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've watched that. I'm gonna have to rewatch
it. It's a delight. And obviously I could talk about Harv for a long time, but if you have more interest, like I said, American Splendor is a great movie. We were discussing this before. One of my big blind spots in comics that I have not gotten into, I got a few of them, is Love and Rockets.
Yeah.
When they have Hernandez there, and that's another good sequence of him talking over the art.
Yeah, I love the art in those books. I haven't read. I mean, I've seen them all over the place, but I haven't read them yet. And I've got a really tall stack of books to read, and that's one of them.
I remember when I first moved here, Strange Adventures, which is my local comic shop that I go to, they had a Love and Rockets T-shirt that was really, really cool.
Yeah.
And I almost bought it. It was like super cheap when they did their moving sale. But I'm like, I've never read the comic. I feel like that loser kid that is wearing the Ramones t-shirt that has never listened to like a Ramones song. They might have heard I Want to Be Sedated or something. And I'm like, but it looks so cool. And I was like, oh no. So I didn't buy it. But yeah, that's a really great one. I love Hernandez's like minimal line. Like, you really look at it, it's like, if you step back, it's almost like an abstract painting, like pointillism, that if you look at it a little bit differently, you're like, it's 2 dots and it's a nose.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He has such a minimal line to everything that he does, and our brain, we're getting Scott McCloud understanding comics, but your brain takes all the information of these sort of minimal lines and kind of just asserts a human shape to it.
Yeah.
Which is what I think about, especially like with what we see with Hernandez's art.
Yes.
And seeing him draw, apparently his brother, because there's Gilbert and Jaime Hernandez, I think, the Hernandez brothers. Apparently, I'm pretty sure it's Gilbert that's on screen, but his brother was off like making fun of him the entire time.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like him like, oh, your car sucks. Because he's one of the few that you actually see drawing, which I think is really cool. But yeah, I got to break into some Love and Rockets at some point. Like I brought up before, I brought up to Cal, who owns Strange Adventures, that I've never done it, and he's like, just grab whatever you can and just start reading, because it's all great, apparently.
Because just from what you see in the movie too, like the pacing and the dialogue, just in what he's doing there in that whole scene, is flawless and
for the time, like Latino representation, gay representation, like for the time, it was out there, and it wasn't like intentionally pushing boundaries. He was just drawing what was around him.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. I mean, there's a adage that I really like that. Well, they talk about that later on with Sue Ko, who does that really bizarre-looking book about South Africa at the end.
Yeah.
That it's like, it's really hard to censor comics. Like, you can just make one. Draw one, photocopy it. You make yours. You know what I mean? Like, there's literally nothing stopping you from making a comic. You don't need it published by Marvel or DC for it to be a comic.
That's right.
You know what I mean? And you can photocopy as many as you want and distribute it and try to sell it places. Like, it's kind of cool that there's this kind of limit to creativity that we put in front of ourselves, that this is some other thing. But yeah, I could just sit down and draw a comic right now, and it's as much of a comic as, opening up this Chromebook or, opening up Mouse there. Which, by the way, is interesting because Art Spiegelman.
Yes.
Mouse, I think, is one of the most important comics ever made.
Yes, I would agree.
I am a huge fan. It's something that I've read every 3 or 4 years since I was 15 years old, and every time I get something new out of it.
Yeah.
As you get older, and how important it is. But what's interesting about this, though, and not to detract from Mouse at all, Raw Magazine. I would love to get my hands on some of those, because I'm a production designer, and the crazy stuff and how they were publishing and the formats of really playing with the form. I would love to look at a lot of those, because it's really cool, because I, like most people, really only knew Art Spiegelman from Mouse and some of the weird things. I knew of Raw as a concept. I know Mouse was originally published in Raw, but to actually see the production studio and what they're doing.
Yeah, to rip up books and put them back together.
Yeah, and the printer being absolutely confused of like, well, then don't rip it up.
It's true.
Yeah, that stuff is super fascinating. Just because there's a few things that I do want to hit on, and I hate to gloss over some of this stuff, but yeah, Mouse, super influential. I mean, it won the Pulitzer Prize. There's not more that you can say of it, but it deserves every bit of accolade. Yeah. You guys know me. I tend to like shit on sacred cows and kind of try to take down popular things, but you can't take anything away from Mouse. No. Not at all. Because I did want to go in, probably my favorite artist reading his own work is Charles Burns. And you brought Black Hole. Now, it's not Black Hole in there. They do... The strip is Big Baby that they read.
Yes.
Now, I first discovered this before watching the documentary. Because the music in the background is done by Shadowy Men on a Shadowy Planet.
I saw that on the...
Yeah, and that whole thing, that song of him reading... For people who don't know, Shadowy Men on the Shadowy Planet did the theme for Kids in the Hall.
Yes, they did.
And on their album, Savvy Showstoppers, which has Having an Average Weekend, which is the Kids in the Hall song, they actually have... the song with Charles Burns reading the comic.
Really?
On the album.
Really?
So I knew that for years. And then I see the documentary and I'm like, oh, this is what's from. Like, weirdly enough, the most Canadian thing in the entire documentary is that there's a segment with Shadowy Men on a Shadowy Planet.
Yeah, that and Silver Snail.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the two biggest bits of Canadiana.
Yeah. I think artistically, I think Charles Burns is my favorite of the, well, with the exception of maybe Kirby, probably my favorite out of all the artists that are covered in this movie. The line work, I love it. It's not like...
He's one of the few artists that I say, that's really good inking.
Yes.
You know, like his use of black is amazing. Yeah.
This is a great story too.
It's really good. I haven't read it for years, but I should check it out. I mean, that pretty much wraps up. I mean, there's a lot of people that we talked about much earlier on.
Yeah.
Do we need to talk about Frank Miller?
I don't know. Like, Frank
I think that said it all right.
Yeah. I have a weird attitude towards Frank Miller. I don't know if
we can just skip over Frank Miller. Frank Miller gets enough love.
Yeah,
exactly. As we said, it's right after this is when Frank Miller hits big and Alan Moore and comics kind of morphs into this different beast than what it is here. So I think
we had a great discussion about Alan Moore when you were over at my place last time, and like I don't know if we shouldn't get into that. I don't think
we would be. This one's going to run a little bit long. We're covering good stuff though. Like I'm glad we're doing it. And then it ends wonderfully with Will Eisner again, the elder statesman of comics, talking about whether or not he thinks that comics are a permanent art form, which is a very interesting point. I obviously think it is.
I think it is. I think like everything in popular media, it goes through these phases, right? And I think that the future of comic books now is going to be that, and I'm not just saying this because I'm doing it, but the independent stuff, the underground stuff.
Kind of always comes full circle.
Because the problem you have with, or that I have with the Marvels and the DCs and stuff like that, is that there's a lot of rehashing in a way. Like I'm enjoying some of the stories actually from Marvel. Yeah. I've still been reading Daredevil and some of that other stuff.
If Marvel is putting out a Daredevil comic, I will probably buy it.
Exactly.
You know.
But I just think for the general public, for people to just, because I got out of comics for a while, and then when I was coming back to it, when I was coming back to it, I wasn't really sure where to jump back into it, and I honestly don't remember. I mean, I was buying like Wolverine just to sort of get back into it, and I wasn't enjoying it anymore at that point. Before that, Wolverine was like, oh yeah, he's my favorite character ever. But you know, after issue 100 and something or other, you know, you've seen the stories and everything. But I don't think for the general public to go into comics, like they know them from the movies, but I just don't see like the general public picking up an Avengers comic and reading it and caring.
I often say it's bewildering to me, and it says a lot about comics that Marvel or DC have not been able to translate the success of the films into comics.
Into comics, yeah. Actually, I didn't actually read it, but I saw a headline for an article the other day where it said, "Why are they not selling comics at the movie theater?"
Yeah,
I was like,
exactly.
Yeah, why aren't they doing that? But I think for the general public, like I was kind of wondering, like if anyone who didn't read comic books watched this movie, would that entice them to jump in and start reading comic books?
Before we wrap, I did have a couple of questions, and one of them is, obviously, we didn't really like straight out say this, but I assume we all enjoy this documentary and think it's good.
Mm-hmm.
what creators we kind of touched upon this, but are there any creators on this that you're like, I'm going to check that out? I mean, we talked about Trots and Bonnie. I'm going to try to seek that out. And
I'm going to check
O'Neill, who did Air Pirates.
Yeah, O'Neill, yeah.
I'm going to try and track down some of his stuff.
I want to check out more Crumb stuff.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with it, but my understanding is not nearly as all-encompassing as it could be.
Yeah. No, it definitely inspires to go out and kind of find newer stuff. Yeah. And kind of my final question, usually my final question of this podcast is, what does this movie say about Canada? But it doesn't really say a lot about Canada. No. You see Silver Snail, he was living in the States when he made it. It was technically a Canadian film because it was financed up here.
If anything, you could probably say, if you look at the comic book creators today, and how many of them are Canadian, how many of the great
out
ones
of Nova Scotia alone, the embarrassment of great talent that's come out of here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Including Andrew.
Including.
We've got so many talented people just in Halifax and around it. It's kind of, not everybody's from here, but they are here, and we're really lucky to have that, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was really impressed when I moved out here, how great the comic scene was.
Yeah.
And really helped me get back into comics a lot. The last thing I wanted to touch upon, and this is a question for you two guys, is that, this movie was touted by a lot of creators of giving legitimacy and how people were embarrassed to say that they're into comics. How public are you about what you do with comics? Like, obviously, we're comic guys. We met because of comics, so we get together and talk about comics. I do read comics in public, and every so often people, I'll go to the bar after work, and, I had somebody, I was, like a month ago, a manga that I like, Delicious in Dungeons. I was excited, so I'm like, I'm going to grab a pint and read this. And these two ladies were sitting next to me, and they're like, what are you reading? And I had to explain to them what a cooking manga was. But, like you at work, do people know about your crazy room in your basement that you have? Because you got a man cave.
Yes,
you got a comic man cave.
I have a lot of comics in there. I do talk to some of my coworkers about the comics that I read, and I recommend some of them. But I work offshore part time, and I bring books with me, and a lot of times I'll leave them there so that whoever's on the boat can enjoy them. And
cool.
So I'll bring either old ratty copies that that I'm not too worried that I don't need to keep.
And do they?
Yeah, they do, and they oftentimes they're really excited by it. Because I work with people from all over the world. I was working with some guys from the Ukraine recently, and I gave the guy a book. I can't remember what book it was. I brought a bunch with me, and he was just super excited to. For him it was like a way to practice English and read comics that he'd never seen before. So.
So you guys glad that you revisited this and we did the deep dive?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I was happy to watch it.
Like I said, as soon as I found out that I could have a conversation about this film and comics, it'll be a different episode, but I'm glad we got to do it. Anything else you guys want to add? Anything you guys want to plug or anything you want to say?
Well, you can catch some of my pieces in Sequential Magazine, which comes out quarterly. Yeah, I'll have some interviews and reviews in there. Yes.
I'm still lettering issue 6, which I hate lettering. It's my least favorite part of it. That's why it's taking so long. It's a 2-parter, so I have to start writing issue 7 next, which I know basically how it's going to go. So.
But you're going to have that, are you hitting up any cons or anything to sell that?
Issue 6 I'll be releasing at ECCE. That's kind of why it comes out once a year, because I always release in the Maritimes. ECCE is really the most important comic book con. It's the con. So it's a one-day...
The best East Coast Comic Con.
East Coast Con. Oh, yeah, sorry. East Coast Comic Con.
East Coast Comic
Expo. Okay. And it's the one where I sell the most of that sort of stuff. So I always just wait to sell it there because I know I'm going to, and it just kind of gives me a deadline.
Awesome.
I'm way ahead of schedule at this point, and I've learned that that's bad because then I'm like, I got all this time in the world now. I'll work on the lettering next
week. Like you're allowed to procrastinate at that point.
Exactly.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for having us.
This worked out awesome. Yeah, we really... I think we picked the bones of this documentary pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, you could easily just spend an entire episode on any of these creators that we have in front of us here. Like, we hardly talked about mouse at all. I was worried about time. Okay, guys. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, North of Normal is a product of Eldritch Creative, which can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. This show can be found at North of Normal on Facebook and on Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for now. Be seeing ya.